This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Kia ora koutou, you are listening to Left From Nowhere on Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM 1575 AM. I am your host, Tyler West, a member of the Otago Socialist Society, which just so happens to be the sponsor of this show. Today I'm joined by Emir Hodzic for a discussion on his work as a union official, but mostly on the current situation of his old home of Bosnia. If we have the time, we will kind of broaden the discussion and talk a little bit about wider events in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, but primarily as they affect Bosnia itself. And hopefully from using kind of Bosnia as the example, we can have a bit of a discussion about the wider region. With the Pacific News section axed for time, we will be jumping straight into the discussion, so I might throw to Emir now and ask you, how are you doing today?
Kia ora there. I'm doing okay, considering. Enjoying the Dunedin's weather.
Yes. It's nicer than I thought it would be today. I thought it was going to be a bit rubbish today, but Dunedin comes through to the rescue for me. So I always start with just a little bit of a bio from you, just to let us know kind of who you are and what your relation to the region is. Yeah.
So as you introduced me, I'm Emir Hodzic and was born in Yugoslavia. So I sometimes jokingly introduce myself as a man without a country. I believe that's Kurt Vonnegut's book. But I was born in Yugoslavia in the late 70s and been through the process of Yugoslav, disappearance and infighting and implosion of the Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, and then went through the process of dehumanization and then a genocide. Survived that and then came to New Zealand as a refugee in the 1994 and lived in Auckland. And the Yugoslav or the Bosnian War and the sort of rehabilitation of the fascist ideas of blood and soil and ultranationalism that we are seeing now sort of spread throughout the world as mainstream. Other than traumatizing, also taught me a lot, and since then I've been an activist, a unionist, and anti-fascist, sort of using my experience and our experience as a warning, to my comrades around the world.
And so before we get into the kind of the meat of the discussion, do you want to talk just a little bit about your work as a union official?
Yeah, as I said, being anti-war activist and unionist. My father was in a communist party in Yugoslavia and raised us as a Yugoslav. He was a unionist, and sort of I have those fond memories of discussions, lively discussions in the house, and how my father respected, all workers. For example, he would, be wearing a suit and a tie and stand next to somebody in a blue overalls covered in oil grease, drinking beer together. And because Yugoslavia did have that good thing of it was a worker state. So I became a union sort of volunteer, started with Unite in Auckland around the McDonald's fast food campaigns. Then when I went overseas and got involved in Occupy Wall Street in New York, and then went back to former Yugoslavia in Bosnia and did some work there with the International White Armband Day campaign and a couple other social movements, including the workers' protest in 2014. I came back to New Zealand in 2016 and started working with First Union as a national oil and gas coordinator, and then in transport logistics manufacturing. And then when I moved to Dunedin about 4 years ago, I worked for First Union as a solo organizer here in the region, but then I had to take a break for family reasons and then became a PPTA, PPTA field officer for Southland and Otago, which I do currently.
Yeah, so a very storied activist CV you've got there.
Yeah, one could say.
Yes. So I think the listeners will probably be most interested in kind of your experiences and your opinions on what's happening in Bosnia and the wider Balkans at the moment. So I think just as a general introduction for our listeners who I would imagine, like myself, not super familiar, might know bits and pieces of history here and there, but probably not super familiar. Would you like to just give us a little bit of an idea of kind of the political system in Bosnia, so we've got a bit of a frame of reference for the rest of the discussion?
Started with the most difficult question.
Well, hopefully it's only easier from there.
because Bosnia actually has one of the most complex sort of constitutional on the planet. And the reason being is that as a consequence of peace talks and the peace deal that was a Dayton Peace Accord, the Bosnia War was stopped by actually recognizing the military gains of the secessionist, Serbian forces at that time. And from there onwards, it's what we call Cold Peace. So the Bosnia is divided into two entities, the RS, or Republika Srpska, and the Federation, which is a Croat/Bosniak-run entity. And then together, that's under the umbrella of the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And all of that is overseen by the High Representative, or OHR, High Representative, who is appointed basically by the Security Council, but also the countries that were signatories to the Dayton Peace Accord. So it's a very, very, very complex, one of the most complex. And that's why we find ourselves here now, that we're going to talk about a bit later, because of these complexities and the powers that the entities have, and the lack of powers that the state has to, for example, rein in somebody like Milorad Dodik, who is a current leader of RS in the Serbian entity.
It actually reminds me a little bit of the situation or how the state is set up in Lebanon, and it's similarly kind of internecine. There are certain roles that must be filled by certain people, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, again, so when the Yugoslav wars were happening, a lot of people thought that back, especially a lot of my left comrades thought that Milosevic, the Serbian leader, was a good guy because the United States and NATO were in a position to, in regards to the Bosnian War, to his forces and what Milosevic was doing, but not necessarily so, right? Because Milosevic himself was somebody who fueled the nationalist sentiment of the Serbs within Yugoslavia, and that kind of spearheaded the implosion of Yugoslavia, because it's other republics, because Yugoslavia was set up, the Federation, Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia was basically made up of 6 republics that are now independent states. And they worked in a federation. But when the nationalism card was used by Milosevic, then the other republics, followed the sort of same way. The Bosnia suffered the most because, unlike Serbia and, let's say, Croatia, which were pretty ethnically, ethnic majority, in terms of Croats and Serbs, and Bosnia was rather mixed. And that's why the capital of Sarajevo is called like Jerusalem of Europe, because in terms of percentages, Bosniak or Bosnian Muslims were the majority, followed by the Serbian population, and then about 14% of the Bosnian Croats, which are the Catholics. And then the reason I said the rehab of the fascist ideology was the use of the blood and soil, meaning that, for example, the town that I was born in is now in what we call RS, or the Republika Srpska. And my town was majority Bosnian Muslim. But because it happened to be in the geographical location of where the Karadzic or Milosevic at that time wanted to carve up Bosnia for Serbs only, meant that, I'm sorry, but you don't belong here. So the genocide was, that happened was all about ethnically cleansing the land and all Serbs in one land. And this is kind of what happened. So there's a backstory to, why is it that's so complicated at the moment? And that's the problem with ethno-states, ethno-nationalist states, that we see similarities with what's happening in Israel, Palestine, to some degree in Ukraine. But this is the politics of strongmen and ethno-nationalist states, creation of ethno-nationalist states on the back of Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia that had brotherhood and unity as its motto. So the loss of Yugoslavia and what had happened with ensuing wars was very traumatic for those of us who really believed in the Yugoslav project, who really felt that we were Yugoslavs. And all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, no, you're not. This is Serbia now, and you don't belong here.
And of course there is, and we probably won't have time for it today, but there's of course an enormous legacy left by the original setting up of what would become Yugoslavia. It wasn't initially called that, but what would become Yugoslavia in the aftermath of the chaos of the First World War, and then later, of course, the fascist occupation, which, if I remember right, it was initially Italian forces and later German forces.
Well, yes, it's a subject in itself, but I'm glad you brought it up because, just quickly, during the Second World War, the Nazis, Italians and Germans, occupied Yugoslavia because the Yugoslav king beforehand was rather, friendly with the fascists, and then it gets complicated, but then things turn nasty. But the Yugoslav, for example, Croatian forces were Nazi collaborators, and that's why the Croatia was at the time called Independent State of Croatia under the Hitler's rule. But the Serbian Chetniks were also fascist or Nazi collaborators who were ultra-Serbian nationalists who were not interested in sort of Yugoslavia as such, the South Slav state, but they wanted a Serbian monarchy, a greater Serbia. So from there, the Yugoslav anarchists and socialists and communists under the leadership of Tito actually beat Nazis. In 1943, in my home region actually, was the first liberated, guerrilla warfare liberated territories in Europe. And only after the Yugoslav partisans, led by Tito, started gaining more momentum in territory and winning, that West realized, we should be actually backing these guys, because initially they didn't want to deal with them because they were Reds, right?
Yes,
they were the Reds, and it was like, let's support the Chetniks who were flirting with Nazis and actually negotiating with them. Let's back them up. But then, thankfully, the Yugoslavs that include all Yugoslav ethnicities formed Yugoslav partisan divisions that liberate themselves without Western help. And only after 1943 the Westerners started assisting or working with. So from this most recent war, the Serbian nationalists and Croat nationalists and others use the Nazi collaborators of the Second World War as the heroes, because they were not bad guys. They were heroes because they were nationalists. They loved their own nation, which is again what a lot of far right groups say, right? So that's the link in terms of the sad story of the Yugoslav implosion, is that a lot of Nazi collaborators and of the Second World War were now seen as heroes, and the imagery was used to ramp up the really ultra far right nationalist sentiment that included dehumanizing the other, and that led to the genocide against Bosnian Muslims.
I'm familiar with, loosely acquainted with a scholar in Australia who's done a lot of research into post-war fascist migration to Australia. So a lot of it is Italians who had been, it was a mix. It was Italians who had both been in the partisan forces against Mussolini, but it also had included people who had fought for Mussolini, who had been a member of Fascisti Squadra, the Fascist Squadri, I think they were called, as well as people who had been in the regular army and loyalists, etc. And some of her work has looked into the same process in the aftermath of World War II in what was then Yugoslavia, or what was then being reset up as Yugoslavia. And I saw just recently there was a news story out of, I believe, Melbourne, of a group of young Croat Australians who were caught doing kind of Nazi salutes and praising some of the kind of worst figures of the Second World War in that region, which I will give credit was denounced by the club in question, and et cetera, et cetera. They kind of didn't back them up at the very least. But yeah, so it's something that I would like to say is a ongoing question. It's not really a matter of just history per se. It's something that has an ongoing influence to this day.
Yeah, and we've seen the reemergence of that kind of ultra-nationalist politics, and again, but in Argentina, states, Australia, and including New Zealand, after the Second World War, when partisans won, a lot of Nazi collaborators, like or fascist forces like Ustasha and Chetniks and so on, ran. And they were saying in countries like Australia, "Are we running from the communist oppression?" But they didn't mention they were part of the fascist forces. And so it was interesting when I was in Australia, for example, that nationalist sentiment there is, especially among young Australians, for example, that would never sort of were born there and never been to Serbia or Croatia, is really like, it's high and heightened. They would have fights and for example, like, don't go to that area because that's where Croats are, and so on and so forth, which is worse than if you were to go to Croatia today, proper. So that nationalist sentiment affects young people because they live in diaspora, and then they dream about this greatness of great militaristic kind of history of the Second World War, or even the recent wars of fighting for the nationalist pride and territory, which is sad, but that's the reality.
So I think now that we've got a bit of a backstory, as it were, and we've kind of touched on a bit of the history and how the Bosnian state is set up, I think it would be good to move now to the current constitutional crisis, which maybe not a huge number of New Zealanders, but those who pay attention to kind of more in-depth international news have probably at least heard of recently. Obviously, it's probably slipped behind a lot of other headlines because we are
going on,
bombarded with all of the different things happening in the world today. But I think it would be good if we could move now on to talking a little bit about that constitutional crisis and what it might mean for Bosnia.
But even that kind of needs some introduction. So basically, where we are now is the general populace of Bosnia, who still remember the bloody wars of the late 90s, are afraid. The situation is that the war could break out at any moment, but there is some hope. So where we are now, and then kind of, I will link in Vucic, who's the current leader of Serbia, in it as well. But Dodik is Milorad Dodik. He is the leader of the Serbian entity called RS, or Republika Srpska, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is an opportunistic gangster who has basically, involved in corruption, has power and all the sort of institutions, has his, he's involved in strongman politics, right? And he's a Putin asset in RS, and also a big friend of Aleksandar Vucic, who is the leader of Serbia, president of Serbia, who's got his own worries at the moment as well.
Mm.
And the Dodik has been able to survive as a leader for many years by playing this card of, creating or maintaining the country to the verge of, conflict by constantly denying or blocking state decisions or institutions on a state level. By saying that if we don't do this, then we're going to secede from Bosnia, and that would obviously be a start of another war. So he always in the past used those kind of crises that he created as a way to negotiate, and we've seen Trump, for example, use recently some of those tactics. You create a crisis and then you declare yourself as a peacemaker when it kind of quiets down. But this most recent problem is that it started in 1923 because Dodik, just to sort of remind listeners again, that Bosnia parliament or politicians are overseen by somebody called a high representative, and this person is appointed, as I said, and overseen by UN Security Council and the signatories of the Dayton Peace Accord, which is OPEC, and they basically can block decisions because the reason for the existence of the high representative is to make sure that the Bosnia doesn't go into another war. So that it's supposed to be a transitional position, but unfortunately, the way the RS behaved, and Dodik and others, it never passed that transitional phase. It's still there, right? So this person has the power to block and veto moves by entity leaders that would destabilize the country to the point of another war, something like that. Unconstitutional decision making. So Dodik picked a fight with Schmidt, who is a current High Representative of Bosnia, and basically by saying that the decisions made by High Representative are not to be, the RS entity is not going to follow, and basically it's legal and non-void, void. Then, in return, the High Representative then changed the rules and made that illegal, saying that, well, if you overrule the decisions of the High Representative, which is the overseer of the Dayton Peace Accord, that itself is illegal. You can't do that. And then Dodik said, well, if you, I will. And then to pass the laws in the Republika Srpska to basically go that direction. So then, obviously, that resulted in a trial that the Milorad Dodik broke the law on a constitutional level. And that was going on since 2024. And then we've arrived now, only recently, February this year, where the decision, or the verdict was actually on 26th of February, that he was found guilty, for basically breaking the law and not honouring the decisions of the High Representative. That is what started a series now of constitutional crisis, because that decision, or the judgment in the first instance verdict against Milorad Dodik, means that 1 year in jail and 5 years or 6 years of not being able to run for public office. So for Dodik, obviously that's unacceptable. Also, let's not forget also that he's involved in a lot of crime, and corruption. So there's a lot of vested in him not going to jail, and also not being denied being in public life. So he came out and from after that verdict in Banja Luka, which is the Bosnian city in Republika Srpska, and declared from this day Bosnia-Herzegovina doesn't exist. And then he's declared a vote in the parliament of Republika Srpska that would ban all Serbs working in state institutions, right? He says all Serbs who work in Bosnian state institutions are traitors, and if you don't resign from state institutions, you are basically a traitor and you should move from Republika Srpska. So that created panic because people know what that means, right? That's a slippery slope to open war in conflict, because Bosnia can't be divided without another war. It's so complex. So that started a huge constitutional crisis. So he technically banned the state authorities, the prosecutor's office, and the police from operating in Republika Srpska, and basically, people that can arrest him and persecute him, and declare that as non-constitutional. And then he followed with laws like the following day that are foreign agent laws, which is similar to Russia and Putin's laws, which is against NGOs, against independent media. Anybody who dares to say anything against him and the narrative is a traitor who is paid by foreign agents, and so on and so forth. So that created a huge uproar. Obviously, the Bosnian politicians from Federation, were also sort of saber rattling, and saying, well, you can't do that. This is secessionist. We won't let you. So this has created a huge problem. Now, Putin and Orban from Hungary came out to support Milorad Dodik and saying, this is a politicized decision. This is a decision attacking Serbs. Vucic, the president of Serbia, called for a national security sort of council of Serbia to deal with the crisis, and flew to Bosnian city of Banja Luka in support of Vucic, because they rely on each other. So that also, in terms of the European Union, created some issues, because, again, Dodik is Putin's asset in the region, and Vucic, who's the president of Serbia, because they still have this dream of greater Serbia that would one day take Kosovo back and also split Bosnia and let the Republika Srpska join the Serbia proper. So that is what started a real crisis, and one of the worst crises since the end of the war. However, there is hope, that there is doubt that there are people willing to follow Dodik into another war. This is another attempt basically by him to survive, not to be arrested and not to be persecuted, by creating a crisis to basically a point of war that he can then use as a bargaining chip. And we've seen something similar in the past. So as I said, you bring it up, you bring the nationalist fervor and the crisis to the sort of start of another war, threatening a war, and then all of a sudden you pull your war sort of sabering back, and then you come across as a peacemaker, because you say, hey, let's talk now. And these are kind of strongman tactics that we see Trump now using. I feel like sometimes Trump has been following a lot of Yugoslav strongmen politicians since the breakup of Yugoslavia onwards, because these are the tactics they use.
I'm actually reminded a little bit in how you've described that of the constitutional crisis in South Korea at the moment, just with the idea of this, I'm not sure, is it president of the RS? Is that the official role?
Yeah, so he's the president of the entity RS. Yeah.
Of the entity RS, okay. But just the kind of president kind of creating this crisis, and then when that kind of crisis has resulted in them being convicted or being charged, and they have to go through the courts, then using kind of whatever they can in order to stay out of jail, and kind of sparking an even further crisis as a result of that.
Yeah, only thing in Bosnia, though, I agree. We have martial law, because the left is coming. It's like, what? In terms of Korea. But in Bosnia, the only problem with Bosnia is that we remember how bloody the war was, and that we have called peace now. And also, there are players now. So I personally don't think that Bosnian Serbs and Bosnians want another war. People are tired of it, and I have seen myself being there in 2014 and 2012, basically between 2012 and 2016 again, working in a lot of worker protests and peace sort of initiatives and social movements that people are now, especially young people, are working together. They are, quote unquote, crossing the border, and they certainly don't want the war. So I feel as if though that Dodik himself is not a threat within Bosnia, because I doubt that he has enough support for actually an armed, conflict. But I fear external factors. Aleksandar Vučić from Serbia and Putin, that if they decide that opening a conflict there would be for their benefit, that then it could happen.
So there has also been a crisis which has broken out in Serbia, which I think might be a good thing to kind of wrap our conversation up with. Could you speak a little bit to, there's been these mass demonstrations against the government in Serbia, and I believe I saw yesterday, I could be getting this wrong, but I believe I saw yesterday that there was a clash, I guess you could say, in Parliament in Serbia as well, with smoke bombs let off, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, there's the chaos.
Yes.
Well, I mean, similar to what I was talking about, sort of Dodik, Vučić, Dodik's friends, he's been a leader of Serbia for a decade now. And he's also a strong man who has politicians under his thumb, the media, local gangsters even, and so on and so forth. So Serbia is, especially young people, are tired of that. And then last year there was a architectural collapse of a station that killed 15 people. And the people have immediately blamed corruption around that in terms of licensing and who approved it and how it was built and this and that. Similar to, for example, in Turkey, after the earthquake, it was found that many buildings got dodgy licenses because of the corrupt politicians, who were just selling them. So that kind of corruption does happen, right? And then people would just burst. The protests started as a result of it. They were fed up with which is corruption and basically impunity of the local politicians. And that grew. And then the students basically led the protests, and they started organizing in what we call, citizen plenums or citizen assemblies, in order to avoid being corrupted or co-opted by the oppositional politicians or, different, personalities, and they would take the protests, They wanted to remain independent, and they were really successful. These protests only grew in popularity across Serbia. In Niš, and Novi Sad, and Belgrade, hundreds of thousands of students and then professors and teachers joined those strikes. They were blockading the universities. They were blockading the main roads, and then they now calls for a general strike. Now, so Vučić's power is really shaken by this, and this is basically a bunch of kids organizing in student plenums and blockading universities, and taking coalitions, so across the sort of spectrum, to fight the government. Now, what started the most recent chaos that we've seen in the news in the Parliament, with the smoke bombs going off and real chaos erupting, is that at that session, one of the main student demands were the increase in spending, to universities. That was one of the main demands, and also voting on the resignation of the Serbian Prime Minister. What's his name? Miloš. So that was, but then the governing coalition wanted to introduce new items, and obviously the opposition, the Green Left coalitions and the opposition leaders just went basically berserk, saying you can't do this. You are government who's falling. You're on your way out. We are only talking about your exit. You can't introduce new items that you want to discuss other than what was already on the agenda. And that's what erupted into chaos, because then the opposition leaders, for the first time, calling for a general strike, where, for example, already outside of Parliament, what we've seen in Parliament, Serbian Parliament, on 8th of March, the International Women's Day, they're calling for huge march under the banner of Shoulder to Shoulder, which is going to be student-led, but also workers. And also under the banner, there was going to be a march that's called Without Us, Everything Stops. So basically you have now unions, workers, students, running these protests with the aim of overthrowing Vučić. So again, I am hopeful. I have seen many movements across Bosnia, the region, where the young people are working together and try to beat back this corrosive, ultra-nationalist, corrupt government, the warlords, I call them, into the new era, and it's a interesting place to watch in the next year or so.
And I think it's worth saying that I couldn't say the ins and outs of what opposition politics in Serbia is like, but my presumption would be that we're not talking about kind of a hardline a communist party or a hardline socialist party or anything like that, even if they are willing to use in their toolkit calls for kind of mass industrial action, which I think most in New Zealand would really only associate with kind of the hardline left, maybe the kind of outside of Parliament hardline left. But in this case, it's more. This is one of many tools that can be used to bring down this government. Yeah,
that's why I say it's a broad church. So, these student-led protests in Serbia and, worker protests shouldn't be seen from the perspective of, the Reds are coming back. It's a broad coalition, but the tactics they use and the language they use, I support, because it is, democracy at work. It is in terms of how they organize in these citizen assemblies, how they occupy universities, how they talk about demands, increasing again of public funding towards public universities. The stuff they're talking about aligns with a lot of left politics, but the people themselves and the position themselves aren't all what we would say lefties. They're liberals, they're nationalists. It's a broad church, but still it has galvanized sort of sense of unity against a corrupt politician that we have at the moment. And Vučić is a problem for the region as well as for the Serbia from that perspective. So I wish the students and the workers there all the best. The whole region actually does. There were protests in Sarajevo in Bosnia. In solidarity, for example, people gather together to show support for the Serbian students and the protests there, because I feel there's throughout the region, and there's a lot of people in opposition to current guard of politicians that are tired of ultranationalism and tired of corruption.
And that's that is what you would hope for. It's kind of it's not a resurgence of a kind of Yugoslav identity, but it is a sense that kind of the issues of border are comparatively irrelevant to what is the actual daily lives of citizens in those countries.
Correct. I mean, a lot of young progressives in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia would like to sort of see the end of threats of border wars, not necessarily come back into another, new Yugoslavia. I doubt that's on the horizon in time soon. But at least they want to move on and say, let's just focus on cooperation, and move away from this politics of every time that we touch you in terms of, your power is shaken, that you threaten some kind of war and this, use of nationalism, us and them, to maintain the power at home. So, for example, I mentioned the Dodik's new, foreign agent laws and the laws on against independent media, and we kind of talk about that. And I've seen that somewhere, it was written, Putinesque or Russian style laws. But I'm kind of reminded that Western countries have recently introduced similar laws in reference to the anti-genocide protests, around the question of Israel, whereas basically criminalizing, dissent and protest. So we are seeing internationally these tactics of strongman politics being now utilized and used, which is a worrying sign. But we have then people in former Yugoslavia who originally kind of that far right politics was was evolving in the late 90s, people now being tired of it and fighting against it. So it's going the other way around. Interesting times we live in.
So we're coming to the end of the discussion phase of the episode. I would just like to, I guess, throw to you any final thoughts that you might have that may not have been picked up in kind of the questions I threw at you.
Oh, I don't know. Got me on the spot here. I mean, it's
I have a habit of doing that. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. I mean, the situation in Bosnia and Serbia, it's intense. But for me, the warning again here is how far the ultranationalism, and the far right politics of identity can take us, and that when we get into those territories of us and them, the logic escapes us. There's it's because it's emotional, and we're seeing that now around the world being used, and also in terms of disinformation and that we need to be really careful of that. Similar at home with the treaties principle bill and other things that kind of start questioning, who is us. And who are they? And to be really careful of that, because we've seen if the country of, they had brotherhood and unity as a motto, can digress into a bloody war. It can happen anywhere. And to really need to hold our politicians responsible, hold them, can't allow the politics of impunity to take hold.
I think that's a good place to end the discussion. So we'll move on now to the reviews section, which I always have. I give 2 reviews. One is a New Zealand review, kind of a bit of local produce, some fresh produce, so to speak, and one that's a free slot for me to just plug something I'm interested in at the moment. And I think it's after particularly heavy discussions especially, it's a good place to just kind of lighten the mood a little bit. So my 2 today, I'll start with my free slot first. And in light of the fact that fantastic Japanese kind of J-rock punk band Guitar Wolf are coming to Dunedin the weekend that this episode will release, I've picked the movie that they directed and starred in 1999, Wild Zero, which is a punk rock alien zombie odyssey set in rural Japan that is honestly very difficult to describe. The plot is very all over the place. However, from start to finish, it is an absolutely fantastic, wild, fun ride. The music, I'm a big fan of the band, so I think the music is fantastic. It very much sets the atmosphere of the film as a kind of sardonic, fun-loving, kind of joyous and riotous mood. And the film, strangely enough, it doesn't really hint at it at all, but takes a wild left turn into very progressive, especially for the 1990s, pro-trans politics, and then kind of dips back out of it. Just there's a very, probably the most famous scene in the film is one where the frontman of the band, Guitar Wolf himself, chastises the main character for his shock and confusion at discovering that his love interest is a trans woman, and this kind of convinces him that he's going to look past his previous notions of what he might be interested in and what his sexuality might be, and he's going to save her from the alien menace regardless. It's the sort of film that is not particularly high budget. I wouldn't exactly describe it as poorly made, but it's certainly made on a bit of a shoestring, and it's one of my favorite, just kind of have some friends around, have a few drinks, that sort of film. A great mood setter, something that's really fun to watch with people, and it's also, of course, soundtracked by a really great band. And if you want to see a very intimidatingly tall, leather-clad Japanese man cut a UFO in half with a katana he pulls out of a guitar, a gitana, as it were.
Katana.
Then yeah, that's exactly the sort of film that you're going to get in watching it. Keeping on with the very punk theme, The New Zealand suggestion I'm going to make is the works of a band called Zukov. They're a Christchurch-based hardcore band who released 2 EPs in the late 2010s, I think 2018 and 2019 respectively. I wouldn't call it metalcore because that kind of has its own connotations, but it's a very metal-leaning hardcore energy that they bring to the table, very politically charged, as you might expect a band with a name like Zukov to be. And if you're a fan of that particularly kind of hardline, really hard-nosed, very kind of in-your-face kind of hardcore music, then this is very much a hidden gem from the world of New Zealand music over the last kind of 20, 25 years, kind of modern New Zealand music. The band, as I understand it, has been on hiatus for a few years now, but you can still get a hold of those 2 very energetic, very fast, very in-your-face EPs on Bandcamp pretty easily, just under their name. And yeah, in terms of the kind of music recommendations I make, anyone who's a long-time listener of the show will know that they tend to lean punk and metal, and this one is no different. But I think it is cool to have this particularly hard-out and raucous music coming out of New Zealand, when a lot of the New Zealand music that gets genuinely really big, for the most part, there are definitely exceptions, but for the most part, a lot of it tends to be more on the mellow side. So I like to take those who go against the grain a bit and give them a bit of a spotlight. So once again, those 2 recommendations were for Wild Zero, which is a film from 1999, and the 2 EPs released by the Christchurch band Zukov. So with those done, we'll get to the end of the show now. You're once again listening to this show through Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM 1575 AM. And once again, this show is sponsored by the Otago Socialist Society. And I end things with a big thank you to Emir for coming on and discussing a situation that many New Zealanders probably aren't really aware of at the moment.
Oh, thanks for having me.
No problem. Those of you listening, you will hear from me next time.
The White Sox stronger by the year. The White Sox stronger by the year. The White Sox stronger by the year. The answer's never clear. You walk upon the sphere. Keep walking.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.